Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. Take Omnipod Dash out for a spin with a no-commitment free 30-day trial. By Inhaled Insulin, fast in, fast out, fits your lifestyle. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
This week, an update from Beta Bionics, makers of the iLet pump. This is the system that, among many other things, requires very little input from the user, and they're hoping this makes it accessible for more people.
We really hope that there will be more healthcare providers and more people living with type 1 diabetes who have those conversations together and figure out whether or not this might be a very appropriate technology for them.
That's interim CEO Martha Goldberg Aronson. She shares more information about recent studies regarding the iLet, news about their submission to the FDA, and a look into the future for this long-awaited piece of technology. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. Always so glad to have you here. You know we aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. I am your host, Stacey Sims. If you're new, the story behind this podcast, which I've been doing for 7 years now, is that my son was diagnosed with type 1 right before he turned 2. He is now 17. My husband lives with type 2 diabetes. I do not have diabetes. I have a background in broadcasting. I spent my career in radio and television as a reporter, and that is how you get the podcast. A quick hello to all my new friends from Greensboro, and hopefully some familiar faces there too. Greensboro is very close to where I live. I'm in Charlotte, North Carolina, but we had an in-person event this past weekend. It's great to get back out and meet some folks. So hello to everybody that I met there. Thanks to our local JDRF for setting that up. We talk about technology a lot here. And let's face it, there's some technology that I think the diabetes community as a whole is a little bit more familiar with, just because some of the players and some of the people behind, and if you know Beta Bionics, you know what I'm getting at, they've just been part of the community for so many years. Ed Damiano is the founder of what is now called Beta Bionics, and he's been going to conferences for a very long time, talking about his son's diagnosed as an infant, and how he really felt like he had to do something and decided to go with this dual-chambered pump. The iLet is a dual-chambered pump, although not in this iteration. We'll talk about that. It's insulin only right now, but it is designed to have both glucagon and insulin in it and be what some people would call more of a true artificial pancreas. We have done many shows with Ed, and we've done many shows about the iLet and about the artificial pancreas over the years, not just with him and the company, but with people who have worn it, who have tested it, who have been in the clinical trials. So there's a lot to parse here. And as usual, I would say, if you're new, go ahead, listen to this episode. It will definitely make sense. But if you want to delve a little deeper, go to diabetes-connections.com. There's a really great search. It's very robust. There's a little box on the top, and just put in, I would say, iLet, I-L-E-T, or even dual chamber. There's not a lot of other things that are going to come up if you put in the words dual-chamber, but you'll find it. And you can also find it by searching for Ed Damiano. There has been a change of leadership at this company. In March, Beta Bionics announced what they called, quote, executive leadership and board transitions in preparation for commercialization of the iLet Bionic Pancreas system. So Ed Damiano, who has been the president of CEO, is now in the role of founder and executive chair. Martha Goldberg Aronson, who is my guest today, has been the board chair at Beta Bionics, and she is now serving as the interim CEO and board director. Beta Bionics has submitted the iLet to the FDA, and because of that, they're very limited in what they can say. We deal with this a lot. You've heard these interviews before, but ask as much as I can, and she answers as much as she can. And we'll get to that in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Omnipod. Omnipod technology is constantly advancing, and you deserve to have the latest and greatest when you want it. No one wants to be locked into a contract. At Omnipod, they heard this, and that's why they have the Omnipod Promise for users getting product through the pharmacy. The Omnipod Promise allows new and existing users to start on Omnipod Dash with no contract, commitment, or obligation. Then you can upgrade to Omnipod 5 at no additional cost, regardless of existing contract when covered by insurance. And get a free controller PDM with your first box of pods. Don't wait. Start on Omnipod Dash today and be ready for the latest and greatest with the Omnipod Promise. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Omnipod logo. For full safety, risk information, and Omnipod promise terms and conditions, also visit omnipod.com/diabetesconnections. Martha, thank you so much for joining me. This is one of the most high interest devices out there. We've been following it for years. I'm so glad you made some time for us. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Stacey. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Let's start, though, by kind of resetting the table. As you know, we've been following the iLet and Beta Bionics for a long time, and there's a lot of information and trials and things to get into here. But what is the device we're talking about right now? Can you kind of take us through the system as it is?
Sure. The iLet Bionic Pancreas is a wearable, investigational medical device at this point that is pocket-sized. It fits in your pocket, and it's designed to autonomously dose insulin. So it's worn. This is very much the same way that other insulin pumps are worn. However, with the iLet, the user only inputs their body weight to initialize the device. And then there are no additional insulin parameters to set. So the device then automatically titrates and infuses insulin without requiring to set insulin to carb ratios, no setting of insulin basal rates, no correction factors, et cetera. So it's really a fully autonomous system after you input that one initializing number, which is your weight.
It really is so remarkable. I know we've heard about it for a long time, but every time you all explain it to me, I still I can't imagine that. Having used, or my son having used, an insulin pump for almost 15 years now, it's hard to imagine not having to have a basal rate or adjusting things like that. But in the broader sense, the system is a tubed pump that works with the CGM and has an algorithm, right? It's like other systems in that way.
Correct. So in that regard, yes, it's a tube system in the clinical trial using a fairly standard infusion set, uses a pre-filled cartridge of insulin, and then gets connected to CGM. And again, in the clinical trial that we'll talk a bit about, that was a Dexcom G6.
Let's just jump into that clinical trial then, because the results looked great. Would you mind taking us through some of that?
Sure. Well, first, I think it's really important to just step back, Stacey, and talk for a moment about the study design, because this is a really, really important study design in that not only was it an extremely large study with 440 participants at 16 sites across the U.S., it also enrolled a cohort more representative of the population with type 1 diabetes than any previous trial. So let me just give you a few statistics around the cohort and who was enrolled in this study population, because I think what's really important for people to understand is it's so representative and frankly, much more representative than many of the other trials that have been run, but it's so representative of the real population of people living with type 1 diabetes. So for example, we had ages 6 to 83 in the study.
Wow.
We had 26% of the people in the study were non-white. We had people with A1Cs of a far wider range than you've seen in many other studies. In fact, about a third of the folks in the study had an A1C over 8, and there was no upper limit of an A1C to enroll in the trial. And then I think the other really important thing to note is just that we also had a third of the group had been on MDI, a third had been on a pump, and a third had been on AID. So again, just an extremely diverse and representative population, as I said, whether you look at it in terms of race, ethnicity, age, baseline glycemic control. And so that is really important to know. And again, as I said, really representative of the real world out there. So I just want to set that baseline.
That's great. It went by a little quickly. Just for clarification, that last cohort, you said a third of them were AID. These were people coming over from automated insulin delivery systems like Control-IQ?
Correct. So a third of the people were on Control-IQ, was definitely one of the products that was being used. And also there were a number of people on 670Gs. And then there were a third of people on some pump with CGM, some pumps without CGM. And then there were MDIs, again, both that had been using CGM and had not.
It's just remarkable to hear a study that we've had AID systems out long enough now that they could be included in somebody else's study. That was just, it really it struck me, along with everything else you were talking about. Also the fact that obviously with the different demographic makeup, but that higher A1C, because we've talked about a lot of studies in the past where people come in with, low sevens A1C and then they go down to, 6.8 or whatever, which is great. But of course, the vast population of people with diabetes need a lot more help than that. When you said there was no upper limit, I don't know if you can dig into this. Do you know what the highest A1C was in that study?
I believe it was just over 13.
Wow.
Yeah. I think as you said, just one, if I may, one other comment about that. What you said, and this is really how we think about how the iLet technology really will find, we hope, its place, right, out there helping people, because we really are going to be focused on that 80% of the folks in the US who are not meeting ADA goal for HbA1c. I'm sure you know those statistics very well, but only 1 out of 5 are reaching their ADA goal. And our belief is that we'll really be able to help that 80% who's not reaching goal.
All right, let's dig into the numbers. I know that most people saw a reduced A1C in this study. Can you tell us some of the specifics?
Sure. So if you look at the overall cohort, the reduction in A1C was 0.5%. If you took a look at the group that started with an A1C above 7, there was a 0.7 reduction of HbA1c relative to standard of care.
And how many weeks was this? I'm sorry.
13 weeks.
Okay. Any idea about that one person with the 13?
No, I don't have those specifics.
I was just curious. And then time and range, that sort of thing was measured as well.
Yes. So let me speak a little bit about time and range. So again, if you look at it overall, what we're really most excited about, and I think is really powerful for the type 1 diabetes community, is the percentage improvement that was seen in time and range. So if you look at the entire cohort, it ranged from about 10 to 14% improvement, which translates to approximately 2.6 hours of more time in range per day over the 13 weeks, again, versus those at standard of care. Now, if we dig in a little bit further, I think, as I'm sure you know fairly well, we saw slightly different ranges. For example, we had an adult Humalog and Novolog arm, and that group had a baseline of 56 and went up to 69%. We also had a FIASP arm of the study, about 114 patients in the FIASP arm, and that group actually went from 54 to 71. And then in the pediatric population, as you might expect, started at 47% time in range and went up to 60. So again, I think when you take a look at the delta there, the difference between where these folks start and then after 13 weeks, where they end up at time and range, as I said, it's very clinically meaningful for people to have 2 hours plus additional time and range each day.
Can you take us through a little bit of practically kind of how it works? In other words, from a user perspective, I get the iLet, I got my CGM, I put my weight in, I fill the pump with the insulin, and then I start wearing it. You still have to bolus for meals or announce your meals, right?
Yes.
But other than that, hands off. Take us through some of that. Right back to Martha answering my question there. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Afrezza. And I know you have a lot of questions about Afrezza because every time I mention it, I get a bunch of emails and DMs coming in. So what is it all about? Afrezza is an ultra-rapid acting mealtime insulin. You breathe it in using an oral inhaler. Afrezza gives you the flexibility to eat when you want while providing proven blood sugar control. Afrezza's ultra-rapid action allows you to inhale your insulin right when food arrives, even unexpectedly, so you can be spontaneous but still in control without the need for injections at mealtime. Find out more and see if Afrezza is right for you. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Afrezza logo. Afrezza can cause serious side effects, including sudden lung problems and low potassium, and is not for patients with chronic lung disease such as asthma or COPD, or for patients allergic to insulin. Tell your doctor if you ever smoked, ever had kidney or liver problems, a history of lung cancer, or if you are pregnant or breastfeeding. Most common side effects are low blood sugar, cough, and sore throat. Severe low blood sugar can be fatal. Do not replace long-acting insulin with Afrezza. Afrezza is not for use to treat diabetic ketoacidosis. Please see full prescribing information, including boxed warning, medication guide, and instructions for use on Afrezza.com/safety. Now back to Martha answering my question about how automatic the system is.
Yeah. So again, to initialize, you enter your body weight. And then after literally just a couple days and maybe a couple longer for adolescents, the system really learns you. The algorithm learns you. And so for each meal, you essentially just quickly enter one measure, if you will, one statement. You just say, same breakfast as yesterday, same or slightly more or slightly less. So as we said before then, right, there's no carb counting, there's no setting ratios. None of that needs to be done. And then from there, the system takes over.
What happens if you miss that? Because I know most people are wonderful about announcing their meals or putting their carbs in. I happen to have a 17-year-old who's a wonderful young man, but occasionally will forget completely to bolus for a meal. What happens when that happens?
The system, as I said, really think of it as kind of like a self-driving car. The system manages the whole thing. Again, ideally, someone remembers to do that, but if not, the system will adjust.
Yeah, my guess would be, and again, I'm speculating, it would start correcting.
Yeah.
Right. I'm curious, and again, I don't know how much we can get into this. I know there's a lot you can't say when it's in the FDA's hands, but for meal announcements, does it continue to learn all the time? Or is it the kind of thing where at some point, like 2 weeks in, you kind of are set? Does it always learn?
It is continually learning.
So even if I had like a slightly bigger breakfast and then I had a really bigger breakfast and then, it'll kind of adjust as I tell it to.
Yes.
One of the things that, of course, has stood out from Beta Bionics over the years is the ultimate goal of using glucagon and insulin in the pump. Saying that this is not that. We understand this is not that. And again, I don't know how much you can talk about it. I assume Beta Bionics is still moving ahead with that plan, right? Are there trials and things moving ahead with a dual-chambered pump still?
Yes. We are moving forward on, as we call it, the bihormonal system. I can't get into specifics at this point, but still very much a part of the plan for future generations.
And I've been kind of mentioning it, but I really should have asked. So this is in front of the FDA right now. You will have submitted for approval.
Correct. Again, the insulin-only iLet is in front of the FDA, and it has been submitted. And as you know, it's very hard to predict what that means in terms of when there will be clearance. But obviously, we have a team that's very focused on answering any questions the FDA may have.
And you mentioned this will be with the G6. I would assume, I just talked to Dexcom, that all of their partners are going to eventually move over to the G7. I would assume that you've already had those conversations.
That's correct. We're in conversations with Dexcom, and that would definitely be our intention down the road.
Are you planning on working with any other CGM partners? Do you have any other agreements that you can talk about?
I can't talk about any other agreements today, other than, as I said, to just talk about the clinical trial, which, as we mentioned, was with the Dexcom G6.
It's interesting. Beta Bionics, and I've followed this over the years, even before I started the podcast in 2015. It really seems to become one of these places where a lot of the do-it-yourself community, the We Are Not Waiting, the Night Scout folks, a lot of them work there now. And I'm curious, as the interim CEO, what's the mood there right now? I mean, it's got to be a really exciting time to see this kind of finally be submitted. Is there still that sense of DIY, and it's a much smaller company than some of these other ones? Can you share any of what people are kind of talking about at the company?
Sure. Look, it's an incredibly exciting time to be at the company. And as you're commenting, I mean, we've been working on some of the branding work, and we talk a lot about being built with humanity. I mean, so many people at the company either have type 1 diabetes themselves or are very close personally to type 1 diabetes. And so there is just an extraordinary commitment to doing the best we can for this community. And I'd imagine that we are a public benefit corporation and a certified B Corp, which means that we are extremely committed to making sure that we serve all of our stakeholders. And first and foremost, as a public benefit company, the most important stakeholder is the type 1 diabetes community. So, as you said, there is a great deal of excitement. And at the same time, the company is transitioning toward being ready to have a commercially available product when that day comes. And so there's a lot of change going on, which you can imagine. And the transition from being, solely clinically and R&D focused to being those things and commercially getting ready for, as we call it, day one of commercialization. So yes, it's an extraordinary time at the company. And those of us associated with it are honored and inspired to be a part of it.
One of the things you've mentioned a couple of times is, trying to reach this broader population of folks. And it is such a difficult thing and I don't have diabetes, so I can only imagine. It's such a difficult thing to you've got to wear an insulin pump, then you've got to wear a CGM, and you've got to think about this, and you've got to think about that. And the iLet takes away a lot of that burden, it sounds like, but you still have to wear the technology. I'm curious if in any of these trials you addressed that or had conversations with folks who are MDI or who had not been offered a CGM. We see over and over again the racial disparity that, many communities are not offered a CGM as quickly as the white community, frankly. I'm curious if that's come up at all.
Well, sure. And again, if you go back to the design of the trial, my hat goes off to the investigators. This was an investigator-initiated trial. My hat goes off because they very much wanted this to be far more representative than many clinical trials are. And you know this, it's not just in the diabetes space, but all across healthcare. Many clinical trials are not as reflective of the true community as one would like them to be. And so, as I said, I'm extremely impressed with how thoughtful this group of investigators was in terms of ensuring that, as I said, over a quarter of the population who participated in the trial were non-white. And we really believe, again, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself until we're on the market, but we really hope that there will be more healthcare providers and more people living with type 1 diabetes who have those conversations together and figure out whether or not this might be a very appropriate technology for them.
You had mentioned the ages of the people in the trial, which is absolutely fascinating. Let's start with the younger cohort. Is the submission to the FDA for down to 6 years? If it were approved tomorrow, would it be kids age 6 and up? Or
Yes.
Is that okay?
I mean, that's the submission. It would depend on what the FDA comes back.
Oh, sure.
Right.
Sure.
But yes, the submission is for ages 6 and up.
All right. And you said on the other side of that, you had someone in their 80s, which I love to hear about. Tell me a little bit about that, if you could. I don't know how specific you can get. I'm trying to imagine somebody, we have a lot of listeners to this podcast who are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. I think we have somebody in their 90s using a pump. And it's pretty incredible. They're not like we envision them as being technologically challenged. They're not all of the time.
No, of course not. I think that's a very fair point. I think the way to think about, as we think about, again, we're not here to practice medicine. Obviously any healthcare decision should be made between somebody's healthcare professional and themselves and their whole family. But when we think about who really we believe will benefit most from this kind of technology, you probably know this from your son, the folks that work really hard each and every day to adjust their dosing, to be checking their readouts on a very regular basis, and who then are able to maintain fantastic glycemic control. What we say to that group is, that's terrific, and we think you should just stick with the technology you're currently using. Where we believe we're going to be able to make a real difference and frankly be complementary to these other technologies is, as I said, the people who are not in good glycemic control, but who don't need to be quite as technologically savvy to have a successful automatic delivery system. So that's the population that we believe will be most beneficial. But we obviously will, when the time comes, spend a lot of time educating healthcare professionals and others along the way.
In that study, can you talk a little bit about hypoglycemia?
Yeah. In the trial, it was very nice to see that there was no increased risk of hypoglycemia.
Do you know if there was any decrease? Because I have to say, that was one of the things we noticed right away is that my son's A1C started coming down without any time very low. There wasn't an increase of hypoglycemia. He just had more time in range. I assume that was the same thing here.
Yeah, there really just were not, the data were not statistically significant to be able to draw any conclusions other than, again, if you look at it, when you normalize these things to the, rate per 100 patient years, the rates in the study were well below the rates that are reported typically in the community through the T1D exchange. And in addition, the criteria that were used in this pivotal trial were actually more stringent than what's used in the T1D definition.
Oh, tell me more about that. What was the definition used?
I do not have that exact language right in front of me. And I should just mention too, Stacey, I think it's important to know, I know you're looking for a lot of additional specifics from the clinical data. And, the data was released, as you noted in an earlier podcast of yours at ATTD with a presentation by Dr. Stephen Russell on the podium for 20 minutes. And there's only so much one can cover in 20 minutes, right? But it's important, I think, also for your listeners to know that at the upcoming American Diabetes Association meeting in early June, there will be additional sessions where more of the data will be shared.
Will the full results from the multi-center randomized insulin-only pivotal trial be released somewhere?
So, as you likely know in this world, a number of manuscripts are actually being written and submitted to various journals. And so one has to watch the timing of when these things happen. That process is underway. And so I can't speak to precise timing of when more of this information will be publicly available.
Got it. But we'll have more information at the ADA
Correct.
scientific sessions. Great.
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to ask you a couple things you probably cannot answer because it's in front of the FDA, but I'm just curious. Can you share anything about how it works? In other words, when we look at Omnipod 5 or the 670 or, Medtronic's newer offerings or Control-IQ, they're out. So we're able to kind of dig a little bit deeper into, they change basal rates all the time, or, they can make 300 decisions a day. Anything you can share about how the iLet operates?
Unfortunately, no.
I had to ask.
But thank you for asking.
Maybe Ed Damiano or somebody come back on, knock on wood, when and if it's approved, and we can dig a little deeper into that.
Yes, once it's approved, it would be terrific for you to circle back with our founder and executive chair, Ed Damiano, and I know he would love to share with you a lot more detail on a number of these topics.
That'd be great. Before I let you go, though, you have a really interesting connection to diabetes history. I understand you don't have anybody in your family right now who lives with diabetes, but tell us this story about, is it your great-grandmother?
It is. So two interesting things. So I'm from the great state of Minnesota. People often talk about Dr. Banning, right, from Canada, who discovered insulin. And it turns out he based his work on an article he read from Dr. Moses Barron, who comes from the University of Minnesota. So that's the first Minnesota connection. The second one, though, is that actually it would be my great-grandmother who was the first person in Minnesota to get insulin when it was first discovered in the 20s. That's my connection to type 1 diabetes today.
Wow. Do you have any history or information about her and how, any idea how that happened?
I don't know all the details. My dad was kind enough to share with me an article that had been in what was then called the Minneapolis Sunday Tribune. She was 85 years old when they wrote the article, and she had had diabetes for 35 years and had taken insulin for about 24. And she had 11 children, 28 grandchildren, and 20 great-grandchildren, and led a very long, active life. So
she had 11 children with diabetes back then? Wow.
Yeah, it's pretty incredible. She first learned she had diabetes in 1915. So
jeez, I can't even imagine how difficult and horrible that must have been until she got an insulin. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, pretty incredible story. But as I said earlier, it's such a special community. And I had shared with someone else recently that I had worked briefly in the diabetes space when I lived in Europe years ago, almost 20 years ago now. And I just thought it was such a special community. And so, as I said, it's an honor to be a part of Beta Bionics. And I'm very hopeful and optimistic and excited about the role Beta Bionics may be able to play in the future as we think about serving this community.
That's so nice to hear. And I got to tell you, we're excited about all the technology. I love having more choices. But this one, I think it's because many of us have met Ed Damiano. He and his son are kind of the face of this, and the inspiration for all of this. And many of us were at some of these conferences years ago where he would debut the actual mock-ups of the devices. Once you kind of see what the iLet was years ago and now to have it submitted, it's just been it's been a long journey, but it's a really exciting one. So I'm thrilled to talk to you today. I really appreciate your time. I look forward to circling back, as you said. We'll hold our breath. But Martha, thank you so much for spending so much time with me and my listeners.
Well, Stacey, thank you. And from everybody who works in this space, we're very grateful to you and all the good work that you do to share really helpful and useful information to the community. So hats off to you as well.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Sims.
More information about Beta Bionics and about the iLet over at diabetes-connections.com. If we didn't say it enough, the iLet is not commercially available. It has not yet been cleared by the FDA. And they've really changed the website quite a bit. They've removed all the photos of the prototypes and things like that. It's a lovely website, But I just think that's interesting, as we watch these companies grow and change over the years. So a lot more to come. I really would like to circle back and talk to Ed Damiano about this because in addition to the amazing technology, it really is such a personal story for him. And I love to kind of revisit that side of it as well. Up next, I want to tell you a little bit about Benny's 504, not something specific about it, but just something interesting that happened recently that made me realize how fast time goes by. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And when we first started with Dexcom back in December of 2013, the Share and Follow apps were not an option. They hadn't come out with that technology yet. So trust me when I say using Share and Follow makes a big difference. I think it is really important to talk to the person that you're following or sharing with and get comfortable with how you want everyone to use the system. Even if you're following your young child, these are great conversations to have. At what numbers will you text? How long will you wait to call? That sort of thing. And that way the whole system gives everyone real peace of mind. I'll tell you what I absolutely love about Dexcom Share, and that is helping Benny with any issues using the data from the whole day and night and not just one moment. Internet connectivity is required to access separate Dexcom Follow app. To learn more, go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. Like most parents of kids with type 1 diabetes, I have always had a 504 plan for Benny. This is part of the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm sure you're familiar, but if not, it provides students with equal access in school, right, for the educational environment. Different schools handle this differently. Ours uses the 504 plan primarily for testing, for state testing or final exams. We have something called the DMMP, Diabetes Medical Management Plan, that really covers the majority of how diabetes is handled at school. Your bathroom breaks and can I carry my bag and can I treat myself during class and all the way down to dosing and things like that. So every school district seems to do this just a little bit differently, but a 504 plan is federal, so it should give your child protection and make sure they have equal access to, as it says, their educational environment. I'm bringing this up because Benny is a junior in high school. He is taking all those tests, that college board stuff, ACT, SAT, he's got some AP classes. And I had always been told you got to have your 504 plan in place to get accommodations for the college board testing. And I cannot believe it is here. But something funny, of course, happened, as it usually does with us. So the first time he took those tests, they were at his home school, and you really don't need to do anything different, I guess, to get the accommodations, because he just said it was, as usual, no problem. He doesn't have many accommodations. I mean, I guess it's okay to share. He basically just is allowed to, he brings his stuff in, and if he's going low, he's allowed to take a break without losing time. But he's taking the ACT at a different school. So we needed to fill out some paperwork, and we checked the boxes that said, we need accommodations. They are on file at our school. Well, the next day, the counselor from school called me. This is a different counselor than the one that writes up his 504. It's a very big school, so there's lots of counselors for lots of stuff. And she said, we need to show that Benny has type 1 diabetes. And I said, yeah, I know. Don't you have his 504 plan, right? I mean, how am I supposed to show this? And she said, oh, I don't have that. I said, well, walk down the hall, right? I mean, there's the person there with it, but apparently that person wasn't there that day. I don't know. I emailed her the 504 plan thinking we're done. A couple of days later, she calls me back and says, that's not enough. I need to show he has type 1 diabetes. What? Okay. Doesn't it say in the 504 plan? But I figured, all right, this lady is overwhelmed. We're just going to make this happen. So I called our endocrinologist, who, of course, is fabulous and we've known forever and ever. I messaged him really, and I said, can you prove that Benny has type 1? Here's this lady's fax number. Go help her out. And I just realized telling the story, I have no idea what he sent. He took care of it. He's so great, Dr. V. And he just said, I got it, no problem. And she said, confirmed, we're all set. So I don't know. I'll have to find out. What did he send to her, right? I mean, maybe he just signed a piece of paper, or maybe he sent a C-peptide test. I don't know. So I have to ask him the next time I talk to him and find out, and I will let you know. But we are all set, I guess. And we will find out when Benny takes the ACT in June. Poor kid, he's taking this test right before he goes to camp. Oy. All right, thank you as always to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Stacey Sims. I'll see you back here next week. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Sims Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.